Matthew, this is a good time to bring you in. I'm sure you will provoke lots of debate on this. Do you want to swap with Jasmine? Are you going to, or would you like to just use this from over there?
If I can make that work.
Can you?
That's fine.
Can you see a screen there?
Yes.
Liam just needs to toggle between. If I put that way, can you see
So what do I point
what
that
you're
way?
doing? Just the right-hand click, right-hand
Did
arrow.
it? Okay. Thanks very much, Alison. It's a pleasure to talk at ODI, having worked here about 15 years ago, as you said at the beginning. And let me also say what an excellent report the AidWatch report is. I particularly like the Italian food aid box because I do remember which talks about the fact that Italy likes sending Parmesan cheese to countries as food aid. I remember a few years ago being in aid negotiations with an African government, which should remain nameless, with the Italian government, where they offered lots more food aid, and the African government's response was, we've already got enough spaghetti and tomato sauce for the next 20 years. So nothing's changed, I suppose. I wanted to talk about the wider context and coming from sort of four different perspectives, if you like. First of all, that we've, for a long time, partly funded by DFID, but also by various other donors, been supporting 32 low-income countries to build their own aid and debt management policies. And most recently, that's led to what we call a guide to donors, which we're working on jointly with ODI. Secondly, from the role as having been the technical advisor to the developing countries in the negotiations which led to the Accra Agenda for Action. Thirdly, in being the senior advisor to the UN Secretary-General on aid effectiveness, and therefore running the analytical work around the Development Cooperation Forum, which includes a lot of work on aid effectiveness and on South-South aid in particular. And then fourthly, a lot of work that I do with international CSOs looking at aid effectiveness issues. To start with perhaps some urgent overall issues, and I was beginning to doubt that some of the things that I said were true, particularly given Jasmine's really pessimistic view about what might happen to European aid. But I was recently in Washington for the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and had a very interesting gave a presentation to low-income countries' ministers and about what was happening to aid quantity. And the question which kept coming back was, how should we adjust to aid cuts which are coming? And I was a bit shocked by that, because even if we're all saying here that people aren't living up to their pledges, there will still be a very considerable increase in aid over the next few years. And I think we all need to get that message a bit more across, because I got the impression that those ministers were thinking of cutting their education, health and other spending plans because they thought aid was actually going to fall. And it's true that, you know, we've had all these cuts, but France, Ireland, very many European countries are increasing aid quite sharply. Others are keeping aid at the high levels they've had before. And we've done some calculations which show that there's probably going to be about a 25 to 30% increase in aid over the next 2 years. So I think we need to have that context, first of all. Secondly, I entirely agree about this whole of union discussion. There is a risk that people could say, well, we're not really able to deliver on the quantity, so let's really focus on the quality, and let's focus on these other flows, like flows from NGOs, flows from global foundations and so on, and we mustn't let people get away with that. It's true that the global crisis, as a colleague from Oxfam pointed out, means that you need a lot more aid. A lot of us were quite happy in some respects with the G20 outcome, but most of the money that's coming out of that is actually not going to the governments directly to their budgets. It's either going to trade finance for the private sector or to direct private sector support, sometimes for infrastructure projects, which of course will be vital to development, or it's going into countries' reserves. And the key issue is going to be whether governments are then allowed to spend that money at the national level, particularly if they have IMF programs. So what is the IMF going to say about letting countries actually spend that money rather than keeping it in their reserves to protect against future crises? And I agree also with the comments that have already been made, particularly by Rachel, about the World Bank and the African Development Bank, that in a sense the crisis has brought an opportunity for making aid more effective. All the arguments that people used to have about, oh, we can't disperse fast, we can't give budget support, seem to be disappearing to some degree as people realize how urgent it is that more countries should get much more money. But I'm not convinced, and I don't know whether I'm sitting in a room maybe of people preaching to the converted, because I don't know whether everybody in this room thinks that the effectiveness agenda is actually the right one. I mean, do most people in this room agree with budget support? I'm not sure whether they do. I'm not sure whether our parliamentarians do. I know that the European Parliament doesn't necessarily quite often, and certainly the discussions in a lot of other European Union member states are quite negative about that. So I think there is a huge amount of work to do, and I know UCAN is working on that here, but also at the European level, in actually convincing a wider group of stakeholders that this way of giving aid, which has been proven to be much more effective and produce much more results from poverty reduction, is actually the right one. Because I think we sometimes assume as a group of aid wonks or aid geeks, whatever you want to call us, that everybody thinks the same way, and it's not true. So there's a lot more to be done on that, particularly because there is a risk that if we have a different government after the next UK election, they will have a very different view of what effective aid is. If it was a view similar to the Bush administration's view on aid, most of us would regard that as a major step backwards in aid effectiveness. But I'm not clear that we've remotely started, let alone won that discussion in Britain. Okay, then let me move on to what developing countries see as real priorities. And this is one area in which, to a considerable degree, the Accra discussions sort of started off looking like they were going to envelop and embrace all of these issues and then lost their way a bit towards the end. First of all, to say that developing countries have a much less positive view of progress than the types of results that certainly AidWatch and even to a certain degree DFID are reporting for themselves. We have a system where we let the countries evaluate what they think of their donors, which is actually the only system, believe it or not, globally, where anybody bothers to ask the recipients independently and directly what they think of their donors, which speaks volumes about the lack of mutual accountability at a global level. And they don't think there's been very much progress at all. You can see some of the results of that in the forthcoming One report on Africa. Even though they also say, as has been indicated by Jasmine, that most of those targets are not very ambitious. One area in which they particularly say there's been virtually no progress is on mutual accountability. Specifically on what Rachel said about Mozambique, I mean, I think, yes, the Mozambican system was very effective in making donors worry about whether they were doing better than other donors, but it was very donor-driven. And I think Mozambique was very lucky to have a large group of very like-minded donors who cared about these issues, who pushed each other. Because Mozambique fundamentally didn't have the capacity to monitor and to keep an eye on and push its donors to behave better, and nor do most countries, and nor do most of the parliamentarians and the civil society organizations in the South. So if DFID wants to do something about changing mutual accountability, where there is a need is to make sure that those other stakeholders really have the capacity to hold donors accountable. At the moment, it's much more donors monitoring themselves, in some countries very effectively and pushing each other very well, in others not at all. Then the developing countries already have come up with ideas on how to measure and monitor things better. One was about multi-year predictability, the 3-year planning, which we fought together with allies from developed countries in the Accra discussions to get into the final declaration. And that was a very good success, but there are other things. The way that the whole Paris process monitors whether your technical assistance is any good and whether it's actually building capacity in the country is pretty terrible. And there's a room for a lot of improvement there. You can't just assume that because your technical assistance is part of a coordinated plan, it's actually good. And similarly, there's a need for greater clarity on what one of the indicators is about program support. And some donors have the habit of declaring anything that calls itself a program, even if it's a tiny project, as being program support. And that came through very strongly in the recent evaluation of donor performance. So there's a need to make the measuring work better. There are some issues which have been omitted. Interesting that actually everybody here thinks they're very important, including DFID, but they're not really in this global agenda because when we sat in Accra, lots of people rejected them. And those were conditionality, having really specific indicators for conditionality, flexibility to project against shocks, and for example, in the current crisis, and providing more money for regional programs, infrastructure, food and agriculture, some of the things which have recently been affected by global crises. Another thing that developing countries feel very strongly about is the high relative quality of multilateral aid. They have lots of criticisms of it, but they prefer it to be multilateral because it's less subject to the type of strategic, volatile decisions that are often taken by bilateral donors. If, you know, there's a fight between the local ambassador and the Minister of Finance, suddenly the aid gets cut off. So that it's much less subject to those sorts of volatilities. Now, what we've been doing recently is dispersing those monies much faster, notably the World Bank and the African Development Bank, but we haven't really got round to thinking about how to replenish them all and to provide more of that money via multilaterals, notably in Latin America, which is virtually run out of concessional money. And then the last issue there, sorry, is about aid allocation. And I really strongly agree with the hint that Jasmine was giving, that division of labour is not, I think it's not only a bit of a diversion, I think it's actually quite counterproductive in some cases, because there are a lot of aid orphan countries out there which actually don't have enough donors. They can find that their one key sector is dependent on one or two donors. And if those donors suspend their money, then they have nothing to do with that sector. So, yes, I agree, in some countries, the Tanzanias, the Mozambiques, where you have 70 donors, you need to think about getting everybody to divide up how they do their labour. But in other countries, quite the reverse. Okay, then let's look, that's the issues, let's look at the architecture. Now, here I should say that I think have a huge amount of goodwill to all the people who've tried to make the process as participatory as possible, both in the OECD Secretariat and among like-minded donors like DFID. But it isn't going nearly as far as it needs to. First of all, there are the developing country issues which I mentioned there have not been fully reflected in the Accra outcome. They have in words, but not in indicators and time-bound deadlines and targets. Even if the OECD and multilateral donors are serious, which is not always the case, then there are three other groups which aren't very much consulted in the process. The southern donors, the Chinas, the Brazils, the Indias of this world, the international and local CSOs, global vertical funds and foundations. And between them, they're now about 25% of global aid. And if we don't get not only them signing up to the Paris Declaration, which is where a lot of the focus has been, but actually what they think is important being included in that agenda. For example, Rachel was talking about getting things disbursed faster and so on. And actually, one of the things that the Chinese and the Indians and some of the Arabs are most proud of is that they do get things disbursed faster and on time and at very good value for money, at low cost. So if we're going to measure those things in future, I'm sure they'd be very glad. But those things were not on the agenda for the Accra discussions. Some of the global funds are already participating, but if we don't get all of them included, then we'll be monitoring something thinking we're making progress, and we may not be, particularly if one of the other things I saw in Washington was that people were saying, well, if all these OECD countries are not going to deliver on their promises, maybe we should go more to these other sources, notably southern donors. Then there's the issue about, and I won't go into all the detail that's on the slide, but the issue about how the Accra process worked. And I have to say it was very considerable progress compared to Paris. I was at the Paris Declaration Conference, and there was very little input from developing countries. Accra went a lot further by having a more balanced involvement of recipient countries, but still there was a lot of time when we sat there watching what was essentially a debate between the EU and the UK on one side and the US and Japan on the other side. It didn't feel like a balanced process in spite of some people's efforts to make it so. I went and participated in a CSO conference, which was wonderful, had about 2,000 people there, went on for 2 days, and then nobody took any notice of what they said in the discussions at all. There was virtually no involvement of southern donors, global funds, and so on. So since Accra, there have been some, I would say, technical moves to get those voices heard a bit more in all the discussions. But there is considerable way to go on balanced representation of all the stakeholders. Then I should say a little bit about the UN, because sometimes people say, well, you know, why is this process being led by the OECD? Now, I don't want to argue that the OECD is an illegitimate organization to do this. Richard Manning, who used to be chair of the DAC, often used to say that it was precisely because it was that it did a good job, because nobody sort of had formal processes to go through. But I think I would look at this rather from a point of view of who does what best. And what is clear is that the OECD probably does the technical discussions and monitoring very well, because they know what they're doing on aid effectiveness. But the UN certainly does better, consulting a wider range of stakeholders, already have been doing that, not just in the DCF, but in all the Monterey and Doha processes as well. It's the UN's speciality, consulting everybody. Bringing in southern donors, and the DCF's intending to do a lot of work there and already has a big buy-in from the southern donors because they feel happier talking to the UN than the OECD. And then taking a more balanced view, bringing in recipient countries' views on what is really mutual accountability and aid effectiveness. So where can we go in future? Well, it seems to me at the moment the focus needs to be on making sure there's maximum balance in the OECD processes, making sure everybody is fully involved. We can probably get some marginal changes to the way things are monitored and looked at to reflect recipients and other stakeholders' views, and begin to prepare for bigger changes at the next high-level forum. And I think a lot of the analytical work, I hope a lot of the analytical work that the OECD is doing over the next few years will be big picture and look at those things in an open-minded way. Maximise the UN's role on mutual accountability, South-South aid and stakeholder consultation, and particularly go ahead on mutual accountability at both global and national level. I think another thing we really must not forget is to influence the new US administration to think more about aid effectiveness. There's no doubt that they were the major obstacle to progress in the Accra discussions. They agreed at the end very reluctantly to some of the things we were suggesting. But if the Obama administration is really prepared to bite the bullet of having more effective aid, it would be a huge step forward on having more effective aid globally. And then after 2011, or perhaps before, we should be able to change the indicators more fundamentally so we can get a better agreement on better ways of looking at this in future, and also move to the UN leading the process in terms of the political and consultations discussions with the OECD providing technical support. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, there's a huge amount in there, which I think gives us quite a lot to chew on. Rachel, you had some thoughts post-2010. Do you want to bring those in now?
I think they were very similar to Matthew's, actually, so I think not to go back to that slide. I think Matthew's summed them up there well. I mean, the other issue that's out there is the question of, is it possible to design an architecture that just has more choice in it for the recipient? So this stuff, the issue of mutual accountability begins to fade because people can actually exert their preference through choice, and there is a lot of work being done on thinking about that. I think the other issue about the future is that trying to create structures in which it matters a lot less where your money is originating from, because it's intermediated through processes at country level that try to make everybody look more or less the same. And that's very much our objective with the International Health Partnership, where our objective is that there'll be one country level assessment process that will assess a country level health plan, and donors will come in and finance a slice of that, and that will be one streamlined process. And at country level, you really, ideally, the vision, and it's going to take a very long time to get there, and it's hard work, but we're very much wedded to getting there, is that you won't particularly notice, which tap was turned on. It'll just, the taps will merge. Mix the taps, I think, is the model.
Right, okay.